3 things have taken my crochet to another level. Hey folks, it's Mary, aka MercyTriumphs, and this is Slow Crochet. Today I am talking about some notions or just little bits and pieces of things that I have gathered along the way that have taken my crochet to another level. Let me start by defining what I mean when I say another level. I don't mean these things have helped me crochet faster because I am slow crochet. It's always going to take me a little bit of time. These are not things that have made crochet easier per se, or even guaranteed results, anything like that. These are not like special stitches or special knowledge. Rather, these are things that have helped me in my crochet experience to enjoy the experience a whole lot more. And some of it kind of comes with some tips or tricks, so to speak. And part of it is also having to do with how I learned. I learned to crochet from my aunt, who learned from my great-grandmother, and my great-grandmother was already long gone by the time my aunt was able to teach me. So that was my main source of knowledge for a while. It wasn't until many years later that I realized that YouTube is a wonderland of crochet knowledge. And this is where I started picking up a little bit of these pieces of what could take my crochet experience and make it so much significantly better. So when I learned to crochet, let me begin by saying, I did not know that you could put a stitch marker in your live loop and that would help it stay and not come unraveled. When I learned to crochet, I was told to pull out a very long loop and just make sure that it's really long. You might even make it so long that it's going to wrap around your ball, and then you stab your hook into that live loop and hopefully it'll catch, and that way your work won't pull out. Y'all, it seems like such a no-brainer at this point, but it was such a revelation when I learned that you could take a stitch marker and put that in your live loop and it would help keep your crochet from unraveling. So what about this stitch marker in particular? I love these because I can do them with one hand. These are my very first top 3 tip things. These are stitch markers that I got in a pack from Hobby Lobby. It came mostly with smaller ones, but it came with about 20 of these larger ones. And what I like about them is, again, they're really easy to use with one hand, so they're not incredibly cumbersome. These are a little bit more so. But they're big enough that I'm always going to know where they are in my work, and I'm going to be sure that I can lock in my live loops when I set my project down, and it's not going to unravel on me. These are also great for keeping my place when I'm doing things in the round. But yeah, number 1, the larger sized, still flexible but sturdy stitch markers. The number 2 thing that has really leveled up my crochet was a yarn needle, of all things. But the ones that I got a hold of that I really like, they are bent. And so you see it has about, what is that, like a 20-degree bend, maybe a 30-degree. I don't have a protractor on me. Y'all science people, y'all mathematicians, you let me know what the angle is on this. But this yarn needle, and I like this size, it came in a pack of 2. I think these were maybe $3.50. I like the smaller size because more often than not I'm working with worsted weight yarn or a little bit smaller, so I like the smaller size here. But what happens is when I'm doing something like amigurumi, having that little bend in the needle makes sewing so much easier. And even if I'm not doing amigurumi, using a needle like this to sew in my ends, number 1, it has kind of a sharper tip so I can split the plies of the yarn when I'm sewing in the ends. But having that little bit of a bend means it makes it ever so slightly easier to kind of push the needle in and bring it back out again, especially if I'm working on something like a sweater. I'm not going to lose my needle in the project as I'm weaving in my ends. So number 2, bent yarn needles, and these steel ones in particular. In terms of affiliate links, I don't have them at the time of recording. Maybe by the time I post this I will, but all of these things I will have a link to where you could buy something similar. I've acquired these things over time, and so no guarantee that it's going to be exactly this thing, but yes, these were Susan Bates. I think this one is a 2-inch. or a 5 centimeter needle. So love, love, love that. The third thing that's really leveled up my crochet, you might be surprised at this, it's a scale. This is a little digital scale, and how I use this is to measure out my yarn. So many times it can be so frustrating playing yarn chicken. When I'm making a shawl, I'm wondering, do I have enough yarn to complete one more row of this shawl or not? Because by the end of the shawl, it takes like an hour sometimes to do a full row. So what I will do is I will measure out, I'll weigh out the yarn that I have left, and maybe I'll do like 5 or 6 inches, and then I'll weigh my yarn again, and I'll figure out how much yarn, how much weight of yarn I used to get part way on that row of the shawl. And then I'll see, okay, I'll multiply that out. I'm like, oh, I have 5 inches, takes 5 grams, but I have 40 inches to do still remaining. Do I have, okay, 40 times, I'll do the math and figure out if I'm gonna have enough yarn to complete that shawl, that row or not. That saves me so much time and so much heartache. And y'all, I just love my scale. I use it so often. I will use it when I'm calculating yarn scraps to see if I think I'm going to have enough yardage to do a particular project. And the math really isn't that hard. It is a basic cross multiplication. So on your yarn label, it will tell you how much yardage or meterage you have, and tell you how much grams, how much weight of yarn you have. And so really you're always trying to find out how much your yardage or your length is. And so you only have that one variable to plug in. You can always weigh your yarn and compare that to how much yardage you get per that amount of weight. I'm probably making this sound a lot more complicated than it is, but I'm going to put up a picture right here of what I mean, this cross multiplication process. But needless to say, this scale has made such a difference in my attitude, has really encouraged me, because then I feel like as slow as I go in crochet, I'm not wasting time. It helps me get through a project, helps me figure out if I have enough yarn for a project, have enough yarn to complete to a certain degree. Maybe I'm working on something that could be long sleeve, but should I keep it short sleeve? Let me measure, let me weigh it out and see if I can figure that out. So that saved me a lot of heartache over time. Now I did say just 3 things, but of course I'm gonna add a few more because that's what we do, right? We can't just stop at 3. I want to add in a couple of specific things. I mentioned my love of making shawls before. Y'all, if this might seem like a really simple thing, but it's a basic T-pen. I used to block my shawls just using the ball-pointed pens, and since I started using T-pens, it feels so much better on my fingers. And honestly, it's a little bit easier to work with when I'm trying to stretch things out and block them in, to kind of push them in on a flat rather than a little ball. You're spreading out the force over a greater area of your fingers. So these are actually quite a joy. I'm so thankful that I took the time to pick up some T-pens for all the blocking that I do. Another thing is specific to amigurumi again. It's some doll needles. I don't know how long ago I picked these up, but when I am sewing like embroidery eyes or something like that, having a really long needle with a nice big eye, I mean, these are not specifically yarn needles, but the length of them really does save me quite a bit of heartache, especially when I need to go from one side of the head to the other and I'm doing eyes or maybe eyebrows. Having these on hand, even if I have to kind of switch the yarn between 2 different needles, I'm happy to do that because it's going to be that effective. It makes it so that I'm not trying to keep from losing my needle in the middle of a fluffy head. So yeah, I cannot recommend enough having a set of doll needles on hand when you're doing amigurumi. Another thing, oh, y'all, we know row counters. My husband brought this home from work one day, but basically he would use it to just keep track of his counts. I use this as a row counter. It is nice to have the extra little click to just remind me that it is going forward. I've used row counters before, the little plastic ones. They're fine, but sometimes I tend to forget to use them, and that click sound just kind of helps me make sure that it's actually happening. I'm actually keeping track, and then you can roll it back and reset it fairly easily. So this has been a great little thing to have on hand, not necessary, but especially when you're doing row after row after row of the same thing. And sometimes when it's hard to go back and count them, maybe you're doing rows of slip stitches, having a row counter can be really, really important and really relieve a lot of stress in crochet. Speaking of relieving stress, this is something that I picked up from my dad. He is the king of hand strengthening, and this is a little tool, a little physical therapy that he gave me after he didn't need it anymore. And this is wonderful for taking a break in crochet. I've heard people talk about compression gloves, talk about like hand massagers, that kind of thing, and look at different exercises you can do for your hands. But I think one of the best things we can do is not just to stretch, but to strengthen. So in doing some exercises with your hands, this really has, like, I've felt an improvement in my crochet, just taking the time to kind of use those tension bands and strengthen my fingers and really work a lot of those muscles, and even use my hands in different ways, like push them a little bit differently than I would when I'm crocheting. So in crochet, if I'm doing a lot of this motion and I'm using these fingers and these muscles, it's not really working out the hand and the muscles to the degree that it would with this. You're hitting kind of different muscle groups. I'm not a physical therapist. I couldn't tell you exactly what the benefit of this is, but I do know that it's super helpful. It feels like when I take a break from using my hook and I take a few seconds to just stretch and strengthen, that I go back to crochet and I feel a lot better. I feel like I can go for longer, that I'm actually working, not just cramping, and it does have that stretch. And I do feel over time that it has really been beneficial to me, really helpful to me. And it's made crocheting a lot simpler or a lot sweeter. I don't tend to get a lot of hand pain. I do know that I am trying to loosen up my grip a little bit because sometimes I get such a death grip that I just kind of clench down, and that's not really good over time. But having something where I'm actively trying to strengthen those muscles in my hands is also a step in the right direction as well, right? Like our muscles kind of work in a push and pull, right? You're either pushing or you're pulling. So if you're pulling your back muscles, you need to strengthen them and strengthen across here as well. Like there's this balance. I don't know if I'm making sense, but regardless, love having that little hand strengthener. To me, it's like the next step of those little grippy things. My dad would always have some kind of hand grip or some kind of, I remember it used to be called power putty, or these little grips that you would just squeeze these little balls and strengthen your hands just as you're kind of sitting idly. He always had those around, and so that one especially I found is wonderful in crochet. It's small, it's not goopy, it's not too cumbersome, and it's really lightweight, and I can put that in my bag, in my little notions pouch, with my needles, with my hooks, with my stitch markers, with my row counters, and I'm good to go. So let me know in the comments if you've tried any of these things, if these have been revolutionary to you, or if you haven't thought about these before, or if I am saying everything that you've already known and you have even better ideas for me. I'd love to hear them. In crochet, it is really hard to reinvent the wheel. It's not a craft that requires a whole lot of extra stuff. But again, these were some things that have taken my experience of crochet and just leveled it up, made it that much sweeter, that much more joyful, that much more peaceful, just taken away a little bit of the frustration that we can experience so that this craft can be a joy, it can be restoring to our soul, it can be replenishing to our hearts, all that kind of good stuff that you hope for in something that you're doing that is creative. Thank you so much to everyone who has hung out with me today. Thank you to my wonderful subscribers. Thank you to my new ones that have just come along recently. I see you. I appreciate you. I'm glad you're here. Thank you to those of you who have been with me from the beginning on this YouTube adventure. I am so glad that you get to be part of my life and I get to be part of yours. I don't take you for granted. Y'all are wonderful. If for whatever reason I'm not your cup of tea, thank you so much for listening this long. I do appreciate you, and I do hope I'll see you again soon. Bye. Bye. Bye.